I've been off topic a lot today as it is. I know. Anyway, anything else, Amber?
Hold on, just let me finish this email.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to get into macroeconomic policy. Before we get into the details of it, though, I need to set up this model of the macroeconomy. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to reintroduce this concept of GDP, because of course it's going to play a vital role in our discussion of macroeconomics. And then I'll introduce the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And then I'll talk a little bit about fiscal policy if I get a chance. The idea is that Chapter 15 covers this main aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and covers both fiscal and monetary policy. There's a lot of stuff that's packed into here, and so I'm going to try to take it a little bit slowly, cut this into at least a couple different days, but at the same time, I want to make sure that everyone gets a pretty good grounding in this basic model. Now, we've only really had a few models in this class. We had the production possibilities curve, we had supply and demand, and now this is going to be really our third main model that we're going to talk about in this class, which is going to look a lot like the regular supply and demand model, but instead of being on a particular firm or a particular industry, we're talking about the entire macroeconomy. So some of the labels on the axes are going to change, and it's important to understand the difference between that basic supply and demand and when we talk about it for the entire macroeconomy. There are going to be some fundamental differences. All right, so what we're doing today is we're just trying to bring together these three concepts of macroeconomics. The three things that we talk about are GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment. We're going to try to bring all those things together into a single model. But first, we're going to have to talk a little bit more about this first one, which is GDP. Again, that's just gross domestic product. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about world poverty. And that's just the value of everything produced within a country, writing properly, produced within a country and usually in a year. Talk about the macroeconomy, we're talking about basically all the economic activity. And when we start looking at the size of the pie, in other words, the economic resources that exist within an economy, gross domestic product tells us what those economic resources are in terms of the overall volume, the overall size of the economy. This is a useful measure just to see how well is the overall economy doing. If you want to think about, like, you know, do people have more to consume this year compared to last year? Well, if GDP is shrinking, then probably individuals are going to be worse off because there's less stuff being made, right? So gross domestic product tells us something about the ability to consume because it tells us basically what's being produced. Now, we had a previous measure, the gross national income, which is a little bit closer to like actual consumption levels, but this still gets us there, and this is the basic measure. Now, the problems, well, first let's talk about a couple different measures of GDP, or different ways of thinking about GDP that are important. It's important to note that there's a difference between what's known as real GDP and nominal GDP. What's the difference between those two?
One's real, one's just an estimated guess.
Well, one's real, but what do we mean by real?
Like actual.
Well, it has to do with inflation, actually. So when we talk about real versus nominal, what we're talking about is which one adjusts for inflation. Nominal is just based upon current prices. So it's the value in goods of goods and services produced within a year based upon the prices that we observed in that year. So if we just went out and counted how many cars are built in America, how many classes are taught at USM, using tuition dollars as the price, how many Slim Jims are sold at Junior Food Mart, all those different things that are produced within an economy, and we counted up in 2016, that's going to give us our nominal GDP. So it's value of goods in the current year prices. So how much all that stuff costs in terms of what the prices of the different goods are in that year. The problem is we're interested in how much this grows, right? How much more stuff do we have this year in terms of economic resources compared to last year in terms of economic resources? Given that, when we look at the growth of nominal GDP, right? Nominal GDP in 2016 in the United States is going to be bigger than it was in 2015. Why is it going to be bigger? There are going to be two reasons. One is that we're actually producing more stuff, right? But the other reason has to do with what? Inflation. If everything costs a little bit more, guess what? Nominal GDP is going to increase. And the problem with just looking at nominal GDP is that you can conflate inflation and actual economic growth. That if everything costs 10% more, well, guess what? Nominal GDP can increase by 10% even though we have no more stuff to actually divide up amongst us. So if we're looking at GDP growth, looking at nominal GDP, we're going to sometimes confuse price changes with actual output changes, and that's going to screw up our measure of like how big is the economy. So we want to somehow get away from that. And the way that we get away from that is that we talk about the value of goods in base year prices. So instead of current year prices, we use base year prices. Another way of thinking about real GDP is just to think of it as inflation-adjusted GDP, right? When you take away the effects of price changes, that's what real GDP is. Real GDP is if you take away the inflation, how much more stuff are we actually producing from one year to the next? And so when we're measuring economic growth, we don't want to use nominal GDP. We want to use real GDP. That tells us really how much more stuff we have. That's the better measure. All right, questions about that? Now, how you actually do it is that they actually have an estimate. You know, they have price data every year, and they have quantity data, and they basically use the old price data to calculate real GDP. Now, what was I going to say about that? So in general, is real GDP growth going to be higher, or is nominal GDP growth going to be higher?
Nominal?
Nominal, exactly, because we're going to have price changes in there too.
Right.
Right. But here's what we really want to care about, is our real GDP. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about this is what's the difference between the way that we calculate inflation if we're looking at GDP and the way that we calculate using CPI? So CPIs are a consumer price index, but real GDP is going to be different. It's not going to be the CPI if we look at the price changes calculated using nominal versus real GDP. What's going to be the difference between the two? This is just kind of an extension. I'm curious as to whether or not you guys think about this stuff. Yeah? No?
Mm-hmm.
So consumer prices only contain consumer goods, right? GDP contains all the goods and services produced. So that's going to include government goods as well as business goods, right? So there's a business price index just like there's a producer price index just like there's a consumer price index. And GDP deflator, which is our measure of prices that reflect nominal versus real GDP, actually contains both producer prices and consumer prices. So something to keep in mind. Now the problem with GDP in terms of measuring the overall value of goods and services in terms of real economic growth are not dissimilar to some of the problems that we had both with unemployment and inflation, are two measures of price changes in the overall labor market health. So GDP has problems as a measure of overall economic well-being. One of the things that's problematic about it is that we have this issue of distribution. Right? It doesn't take into account income inequality. So we just know how much stuff is produced. We don't know who's actually getting the stuff. So if we want to talk about an economy being better off because there's a higher GDP, well, we don't necessarily know who is better off within that economy. That's definitely an issue. Another issue that we have with it is that values market production only. So last time we talked about how one of the main changes in labor force participation in the United States over the last 50 or 60 years has been the increase in the number of women that work outside the home, right? So that's been a big change in terms of what's gone on in the labor force. What's happened to GDP as a response to more women working outside the home? What's that going to do to the value of market production?
Are you talking about how like they're raising competition for others?
It's not really competition, but think about market production. If you're not producing in the market, where are you producing?
No.
In the home, okay. So if GDP doesn't count home production, it only counts market production. And let's say, for a while I was the primary caregiver for my daughter, right? So I would spend about 6 hours a day while my wife was at work producing child care services, okay? At some point, I realized I couldn't finish my dissertation and watch my daughter as well, so we put her in daycare. What's happened to GDP due to that? What's happened to the value of overall market production?
It's increased.
It's increased. Has the actual number of goods and services produced increased?
No.
Right. She was being watched by one person, me, and now she's being watched by someone else, the daycare, right? It's not as if she wasn't being watched before. Oh, the only thing is we've outsourced it to somebody to pay them to watch her rather than my doing it myself. Okay? Likewise, if you decide to start eating out every night instead of cooking at home, what's going to happen to GDP? It's going to go up, right? Because you're going to pay some money for food at the grocery store, but it's not going to be anywhere nearly as much as what you're going to pay at Olive Garden or whatever else, right? So the value is only valued if it's bought and sold. If you have a home, if you have a garden at home, and like I just planted a bunch of green beans the other day, and if I grow those green beans and I eat them, myself, that's not going to be counted in GDP. But those same green beans, if I bought them at the store, that would be counted in GDP, right? So as there are shifts in how much is domestically produced versus produced for market consumption, GDP is going to change. And it's going to undercount what's going on in the home. And it's going to overcount things that are going on in the market, which may not actually affect people's well-being, right? People aren't necessarily better off just because they don't have time to cook at home, right? There's more stuff going on. There's more economic activity. We're counting more stuff happening in the economy, but it's not necessarily that people are better off. As a matter of fact, we can claim that, given the amount of trans fats and, everything else that they're consuming, then maybe actually they're making themselves worse off in some way. But that's neither here nor there. But it is important to keep in mind when you think about GDP as a measure of overall economic activity. Something we've talked about before, wealth liquidation and environmental damage. The example that they give in the textbook talks about how, what happened to GDP in places that were affected by Hurricane Katrina, starting about 3 to 6 months after Hurricane Katrina. What happened to the GDP of, what was going on the coast, for example?
Sure, it went up.
It went up briefly because
Gas?
Reconstruction,
right? Well, you take capital stock, right? You take all these homes, right, that are sitting there worth something. They're valuable assets. You destroy them, right? That doesn't show up in GDP. The destruction of capital doesn't show up in GDP. But when you have to rebuild it, that shows up as positive GDP because there's more economic activity as you're building new homes, right? So it's this weird thing where if you go out and you destroy a house and rebuild it, then you're increasing GDP somehow, right? Even though the value the actual house, the value of the house may not have changed. So the asset itself may not have changed, but you're showing that there's an increase in GDP, right? So this is something to think about. And we talked about the same thing with wealth liquidation, right? If you have, oil in the ground, that oil is an asset, and if you sell that oil, it's GDP, but if you don't sell the oil, then it's not showing up here, right? So just selling off your assets is showing up as somehow making people better off. But, you basically are selling off your future, right? Likewise with rainforests and everything else, right? So there are some problems with GDP. But nonetheless, it's the best thing we have, and it's not a bad shorthand for overall economic activity. So don't discount it too much, but it's always, keep this in mind because if, someone said, oh, GDP growth, that doesn't really matter. Say, well, I understand that it only values market production, but there hasn't been that much of a shift in market production over, one semester to the next or one quarter to the next. So. All right, let's introduce this model now. This is known as the aggregate demand. So AD stands for aggregate demand. AS, aggregate supply. Model. And so what this model shows is, in aggregate, what's going on with the demand for all the goods and services in the economy, and likewise, the supply of all the goods and services in the economy, and how that interaction between the demand for everything and the supply of everything affects price level, GDP, and unemployment. That's where we're going with this. Now, again, aggregate just means everything, cumulative, all together, all the stuff. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Now, the following is going to be one of those things where, if I just happen to run into you at, homecoming 10 years from now, Eric, and I say, hey, Eric, do you remember anything from that Eco 101 class, right? I might ask you that. So be prepared 10 years from now. This is like one of the two things that I might actually expect you to remember. If you remember anything about this class, this is one of those things. And it's the following equation. It's not heavy math, don't worry.
Carrie, you said formula equation.
Very simple equation.
That's what they all say. And I still have yet to come across one time I knew the quadratic formula.
It is nowhere nearly as complicated as b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. It's nowhere nearly as complicated as that.
Negative b plus minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Got a trick.
There you go. It's nowhere nearly as complicated as that. This is the aggregate expenditure equation. I'm going to use this term expenditure. If you just want to think about this as aggregate demand, then that's just fine in this class as well. Basically, it tells you about the different components of aggregate demand. Where Y is equal to our GDP. So this tells you that gross domestic product on the demand side is equal to C, which is consumption, all right? C is for consumption, plus I, which is investment, plus G, which is government purchases of goods and services, plus exports, minus imports. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Sometimes you'll see this in other textbooks as NX for net exports, which is this is the same thing as exports minus imports. Right? Now, where does this come from? all the value of everything that people buy in an economy. Aggregate expenditure, you're spending money, aggregate expenditure. Aggregate expenditure has to be purchased by one of three entities. Who can buy a truck, right?
Households.
Households, and that's consumption, right? So if I go out and buy a Ford F-150, then guess what? That's consumption, right?
Businesses.
Businesses, this is generally fixed investment or inventory investment or machine investment. So investment means purchase of goods and services by businesses. So it's either going to be households or businesses, or Southern Miss could buy a truck. And as we were talking about before, they're a government entity. And so that'd be a government purchase of goods and service, right? But the problem is that some of the stuff that's being produced in the economy, right, real GDP, isn't sold to consumers in the United States, businesses in the United States, or the U.S. government. Who do we sell some of the stuff that's produced here to? Other countries, right? Some university, in Mexico City. Well, in that case, then that truck needs to also be counted because we're talking about all the demand for our goods and services, so that's exports. And likewise, maybe we bought that truck, but maybe we bought a truck that's actually built some other country, and so we need to take that out of this equation.
Okay.
So we're adding up household purchases, business purchases, government purchases, and then we have this correction for foreign entities that buy our stuff, subtracting off all the stuff that we buy from foreigners. And that tells us what the total demand for goods and services is in the economy.
But how does that play with the taxes involved? Because I know we tax the hell out of exports and imports. So how do taxes come into play in this? Oh God, don't you dare throw no percentages.
No percentages. We're good. Okay, so this is the value of all the goods and services produced.
Right.
Okay, so and think about it in terms of the actual stuff that's bought out of the stuff that's produced, right? So you earn some money, right? And you buy something, and you're saying that some of that money that you're using goes towards taxes.
Right, that income tax.
Okay.
So
So does that change the amount of, does that change the good, when we're counting up as stuff here? So
Right.
you're talking about some of your dollars go somewhere else, but do you need does any of that stuff disappear because you're paying taxes?
no.
No, right? So the stuff is what we're focused on here, not the dollars. Now, if we wanted to add up dollars, we could do it with a different calculation, and ultimately we get to the same place. And where do those taxes go to?
The government.
The government that then buys stuff, right? So when the government buys a good or service, then it shows up in here. But when you're paying it out, because we're not counting it on the loss of income side, we're only looking at the goods and services that are bought and sold.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
Make sense? Okay. Right. So that's how we count up our aggregate demand. So when we use the model and we show whether or not aggregate demand is shifting to the right or shifting to the left, think about how these things are changing, right? So for example, if we did increase the income tax rate, right, and nothing else changed, right, we just increased the amount of income tax, what would happen to overall consumption by households?
It would decline.
It would decrease, exactly, right? And so we would show an increase in taxes as decreasing consumption. And that's one of the ways that the government ends up affecting this. Now, if the government then turns around and buys stuff with those taxes, then it could also increase aggregate demand. But those are two separate decisions, right? They can decide to tax you but not spend it, or they can decide to spend money without taxing you.
Okay.
Right. Questions, comments? Right. So this is going to be our workhorse when we talk about fiscal and monetary policy, is this entire equation right here. Now, for those of you that have seen some higher level macroeconomics, this can involve a lot of different things, and we can go through and talk about all the different things that affect C, all the different things that affect I, blah, blah, blah. We're going to try to simplify that a lot in this class, but it's still important to keep this in the back of your mind. All right. Is it the eraser or the line? That's always the question. Maybe that eraser.
Might be better.
Yeah, I think it is a bit of both. But it's weird because like blue generally isn't a problem color for these boards, but I think it might be for this one. Let's see if red works okay. All right, so let's think about the actual model. Really read that. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. On the y-axis, what do we generally put on the y-axis for our typical supply and demand model? Price. In this case, instead of price, we want to get some aggregate measure of prices. So instead of a single price for, like, say, falafel, or pizza, or beer, whatever else it is, we want some aggregate measure of price. And what is that aggregate measure that we generally use? What's the overall price?
Yearly?
Well, if we want to talk about some sort of measure that tells us something about what's going on, not just with a single price, but all prices in the economy, what do we call that?
GDP?
Not GDP, that's talking about stuff. We're going to get there soon. So in general, the subject is dealing with inflation, unemployment, or GDP growth.
Yeah.
Inflation, right? How do we measure inflation?
CPI.
With the CPI. Now, technically, we should probably use something like the GDP deflator on the y-axis, but just think about this as the CPI, right? Do you need that? No, you're good? Okay. So think about this as the price level or the CPI. So it's the overall level of prices in the economy. One way to think about that is like the consumer price index, right? On the x-axis, before we had quantity, right? So what is our measure of the quantity of goods and services in the economy?
Output.
Our output, in this case, it's our real GDP. That's the total output in the economy. So we have kind of like a P and kind of like a Q, a price and a quantity. In this case, we have the price level, that's our macro measure of prices, and we have real GDP, which is our macro measure of quantities. Now, if you remember previously, what does demand look like? What does supply look like?
Supply is upward sloping.
Supply is going to be upward sloping,
So demand's the other way.
and demand's the other way. All right. Aggregate demand is going to be downward sloping. Now, I like a version of this model that you'll find in the appendix to chapter 15, where you don't just have an upward sloping portion. In other words, you don't just have an upward sloping curve for aggregate supply. Instead, you have three different segments where you have part of it is horizontal, part of it is upward sloping, and part of it is vertical. If we get to that in next class, then we'll get there, but we may not. Okay. So that, I think, is a better, more accurate representation of exactly how the interaction between aggregate demand and aggregate supply affects prices in the economy. And that actually kind of ties into some broader understanding of like Keynesian economics and classical economics. And I think it's a little bit better. This isn't a bad shorthand. It's not a bad place to start. I think for most macroeconomic fluctuations, we're in this world, but sometimes we get on the Keynesian portion, sometimes we get on the vertical or classical portion. Okay, so thinking about this then, we have an aggregate demand curve that's downward sloping, and previously we said, well, there's this like income effect and substitution effect, which causes that when there's going to be higher prices, the quantity demanded is going to decrease, right? Higher prices, quantity demand decreases, and when there's higher prices, the quantity supplied increases because of opportunity costs and marginal costs increasing as well, right? Those were our stories before. Now there's a slightly different intuition. The one story that I like to think about with price level decreasing and aggregate demand decreasing is to think about this. When the price level decreases, right? In other words, when everything gets cheaper, you okay there, Amber?
Yeah.
Okay. When everything gets cheaper in the economy, and if you have $100,000 in the bank, which some people do. I don't have $100,000 in the bank, but I could have $100,000 in the bank. If I had $100,000 in the bank and the price level gets cheaper, what's happened to the real value of that $100,000?
It's going up.
It's gone up. And when I consume things, I partially consume it out of my current income, but I also partially consume out of my overall wealth. And so when price levels fall, the value of nominally denominated assets, in other words, assets that are real, that are in current dollars, like $100,000 in the bank, the value of that $100,000 in the bank increases, so I'm going to be more willing to buy stuff because guess what? I'm richer. Price level falls. If I have $100,000 in the bank, I can now buy more stuff with it. I'm going to increase my purchases, and therefore aggregate demand is going to be downward sloping. Decrease in price level, increase the aggregate demand overall. In terms of the upward sloping aggregate supply, the story that I think is probably most salient is you think about the price level rising. That means on average all prices change. But think about wage negotiations. Okay. If there's inflation today, 10% inflation, like all of a sudden this month, right? What does that mean in terms of what you're going to buy? So you go to the bread, instead of a loaf of bread costing $2, it's going to cost $2.20. Instead of a gallon of gas costing, $1.80, it's going to cost $1.98, right? All of these prices are going to increase, right? But if I'm a producer, I can change my prices really quickly. Junior Food Mart, they can change their price on the hour if they want to for gas, right? Corner Market, they could probably change their price for bread every couple of weeks easily, right? What about resource prices? What about like labor prices? How quickly do businesses change wage rates?
Not very often, because then it would cause like a worker strike.
Well, not only that, but think about it like just in terms of contracts. Like at Southern Miss, what ends up happening is that we get a contract every August. And during the calendar year, we can't renegotiate that contract in any way. So if they say you're going to earn $50,000 as of August, then from August, actually the funny thing is they start the contract in September. So from September until for faculty until the end of May, they're going to earn that $50,000. And if there happens to be unexpected inflation in the middle of the year, well, guess what? Too bad. That contract still says $50,000. It doesn't say inflation adjusted $50,000. So if you think about prices being able to move more rapidly than salary contracts, that means as the price level increases, what's going to happen to the overall profitability of a firm?
It's going to go down.
It's actually going to increase because now they can sell their stuff for a higher price, but they don't have to pay their workers anymore. And so that allows them to expand production because now their resource costs are relatively lower compared to how much they could charge for their output. And so short-term inflation is going to cause an expansion in aggregate supply. And for that reason, you get the aggregate supply curve being upward sloping because this difference in basically the ability to change prices versus wages, right? Because wages are a little bit sticky, prices are less so. That's one story that I can tell, and now I'll just stick with that one. You can do other versions of this as well. So if we have an upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, and now let's say that there's some sort of change in the economy. Specifically, let's say taxes increase. Right? This was our example before, right? So if taxes increase, which one of those factors, C, I, G, exports or imports, are going to be affected?
Consumption.
So consumption we know is going to go down. Investment, what's that?
I was going to say government purchases.
But remember, there's a distinction between taxes and government purchases. So we can tax you more, but it's a separate decision as to whether or not we actually want to spend that money, because it could be an issue of trying to pay down the debt.
Yeah.
Right.
Imports might go down when consumption does.
So imports will go down, but which one will go down more?
Consumption.
Consumption will go down. So imports will go down, but less than consumption. Because there's only some fraction of our overall consumption that is made up by imports. imports, right? So we have a marginal propensity to import is the way that we talk about this. Exports won't be affected. Businesses, we're talking about specifically household personal income taxes. That's not going to be affected. Government spending is an independent variable as well. So if this goes down, and this goes down by a little bit less than that, what's going to happen to the overall aggregate demand? It's going to shift to the left or to the right.
Left.
It's going to end up shifting to the left. So we show that as a leftward shift in the aggregate demand. And we go from price level 1 to price level 2. And we go from real GDP 1, remember real GDP, we're using the letter Y for that, to real GDP 2. And so remember where we wanted to go with all this stuff. We want to explain the fluctuations in inflation, GDP growth, and unemployment. Those are our three main macroeconomic measures, and so we want to use this model to explain how certain policies or certain changes in the economic environment affect these three. So, if the government raises taxes and makes no other changes, what's going to happen to inflation?
Wait, hold on, repeat that one.
Okay, so what we've done is our policy that we've brought into place is we've raised taxes.
Mhm.
Okay. We have these three macroeconomic variables that we care about, right? These are the things that we try to watch. And the question is this one policy variable changes, tax rates on personal income increases, what's going to happen to inflation, what's going to happen to GDP growth, and what's going to happen to unemployment?
Unemployment's gonna rise. Right?
So inflation does what?
Gonna rise.
It's going to rise. So we showed from PL1 to PL2. So what's going to happen if the price level goes from PL1 to PL2? What should happen to inflation? It ends up going down because now everything is relatively cheaper, and that would actually be deflation. Now, we use a lot of shorthand in this model, and we generally assume, well, if population is growing every year, then there's going to be more kind of economic activity, and so really, things are kind of shifting to the right always, and so what that's going to do is that's going to slow down the rate of increase in inflation. But it's either going to be deflation or disinflation because of a tax increase. So we're going to say inflation decreases in some way, right? If there's either deflation or there's disinflation. GDP growth, likewise, we move that to the left, so that's going to be decreases. The only thing that we don't really have explicitly on one of the axes, right? So we have inflation measured by the CPI. We have GDP growth measured by our x-axis. We don't have unemployment in here explicitly. What is the relationship generally between the level of goods and services that are being produced in the economy and the unemployment rate?
Don't they correlate to one another?
They do correlate pretty strongly. So if there's GDP growth, we'd expect unemployment to go down. And if the GDP is shrinking, then we'd expect unemployment to rise. And so unemployment then should be increasing. And the way that we model this, and this is the reason why I like that three-piece aggregate supply model where you have a horizontal piece, an upward sloping piece, and a vertical piece, is that vertical piece represents our natural rate of unemployment. And the further you get away from that, the higher the unemployment rate is. And so you can always kind of look at it and say, oh, if the natural rate of unemployment is represented when we're hitting potential GDP over here, then I know the further to the left I get, the higher unemployment is, right? But you can just remember if GDP growth is decreasing, then unemployment should be increasing.
So the vertical one is like long run aggregate supply.
That's our long run aggregate supply, exactly. So this is just a quick example using this model. Let me just describe a couple different kinds of policies really quickly before we get into the whole story about fiscal versus monetary policy. It is mostly the blue. The red comes off just fine.
So the marker,
It says marker. Yeah, it's marker, not the eraser. All right. So we have two main types of government policy that can affect the macroeconomy. Fiscal policy and monetary policy. I don't know why I go back to the blue. I know it's the worst one, but I go back to the blue.
That's why we're using it.
Because it's worse.
Yes, exactly why.
It's like the dismal science, we want to be dismal.
This is what you gave us, so.
All right. Fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxes to affect inflation, unemployment, and GDP. So whenever you're talking about a tax cut or a tax increase or a government spending increase or a government spending that's directed towards doing something about inflation, unemployment, and GDP, and we can talk about the different kinds of these policies that we have, then that's going to be fiscal policy. Now, who sets fiscal policy then? Who are the entities that do that? Eric?
government,
So who in the government then?
Congress,
So Congress along with
President.
the president, right? So this is through some legislative act. Usually, sometimes it's automatic. In other words, there are certain ways that the tax code has already been written, such that when there are certain changes in the economy, that sometimes you're going to get a fiscal policy effect. For example, the fact that we have a progressive tax system means that there's this automatic stabilizer, which is that as incomes shrink, we automatically are going to be pulling less on average from those incomes because we tax incomes higher as they get higher, right? We had a higher rate when they get higher. So that's kind of an automatic policy. Usually, though, this is some sort of specific legislative act that has to be signed off on the president. So, for example, in 2001, when President Bush passed his tax cuts, 2001, 2003, those were specific uses of fiscal policy in order to stimulate the economy. Monetary policy. This is use of interest rates and the money supply to affect inflation, unemployment, and GDP. So who is it that does this? So who does monetary policy? The Fed. So our central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve System, is the one who affects monetary policy. It's important to keep in mind that even though when we talk about monetary policy, we talk about the Fed, that we're not talking about the government, right? That they're two different things. We talk about the federal government as being the one that does the fiscal policy to distinguish it from the state governments, but the Fed is actually shorthand for the Federal Reserve System, which is our central bank. It's important to keep in mind that these are two separate entities. There's only really a loose oversight of the Fed by the federal government, which involves that the Fed chair has to report twice a year to Congress, and the Fed that the president appoints the Fed chair for 7-year terms. 7-year terms, yeah, 7-year terms.
So are the feds the one that come after you if you're like scamming out on your IRS?
No. So it's not the feds. The feds that come after you are actually like the federal government agencies, and so that's going to be the IRS, right? So that's going to be part of the federal government rather than the Fed. It's confusing. The terminology is it's the Federal Reserve System, but it's not part of the government per se. It's more like a quasi-governmental agency. It has contracts with the federal government. It has to report to the federal government. It has entities or it has positions that are appointed by the federal government, but it's not the federal government. It's supposed to be independent. And the reason is actually very, very good, right? So in a lot of countries, the central bank governor, the board of directors are all appointed and serve completely at the discretion of either the president or the Congress or something like that, right? In the 1980s in Mexico, we saw exactly the problem with this, which is what do you do to increase GDP in the short run? Well, one of the things that you can do, right, you can do fiscal policy. We'll talk about some problems with that. But you could use monetary policy. You could lower interest rates, basically give people lots of loans, make it very easy to get loans, and that's going to increase GDP growth in the short run, right? But, as we'll come to later, it also increases inflation in the longer run. So the temptation is if the federal government, if the people that are elected get to control this stuff, then they would inflate. Basically, they would lower interest rates, increase the money supply every time there's an election coming by, because then, guess what? People have jobs, everyone's happy, and then they don't have to actually pay for it with higher inflation for a couple of years, right? And for that reason, it's a really bad idea to have this controlled by the same people that control that. This is the idea of central bank independence. It's very, very important. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind, is that there's this distinction between fiscal policy and monetary policy. The next distinction to keep in mind is that we have two different versions of each one of these. And I'm not going to give the different version by each type of fiscal versus monetary. But I'm just going to say there's expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary policy and contractionary policy. For fiscal policy, expansionary policy, I will just go ahead and say this, on the fiscal side, would mean decreasing taxes and increasing government spending to increase GDP growth. So on the fiscal side of things, you would want to increase consumption by not taxing people as much, or to directly stimulate the economy by going out and buying a bunch of B-52 bombers with the goal of stimulating the economy, making it grow. On the monetary side, on the monetary policy side, we would want to lower interest rates to increase GDP growth. So the idea, again, expansionary policy, we're trying to expand the economy, we're trying to grow GDP. There are other instruments you can use, by the way, for monetary policy if you want to expand it, but we're just doing kind of a shorthand version here. Likewise, there are other kind of more subtle instruments you could use for fiscal policy, but I think that's a fine. Contractionary policy, then, on the fiscal side, you would want to increase taxes and decrease government spending to decrease inflation. And on the monetary side, I don't know why I wrote side there, just monetary, you want to increase interest rates to decrease inflation. So the fundamental problem in the knife's edge or the middle of the road that both the Fed and the government are trying to walk is that you want to stimulate the economy such that there's robust GDP growth, that there are plenty of jobs being created. But you don't want to have aggregate demand increasing so much that you cause inflation. And so whenever there are stimuli that are happening to the economy, the government is saying, oh, should I somehow try to make it to grow faster, cutting taxes, increasing government spending, or decreasing interest rates, or is there inflation, which is a problem, therefore I'd want to raise taxes or decrease government spending or increase interest rates. Now in general, we see that monetary policy is used both in an expansionary way and in a contractionary way. That the Fed is very concerned about inflation and GDP growth because they actually have to worry about unemployment as part of their charter. It's kind of like a secondary thing. Primarily they worry about inflation, but they also have to worry about unemployment. So the Fed tries to do both these things. It tries to set interest rates in a way that you're growing, but not growing too quickly to cause inflation. Fiscal policy, in reality, you almost never see contractionary fiscal policy. The government never directly tries to raise taxes or decrease government spending in order to slow down inflation. It's seen as not very effective because there's this long lag, but also it's just generally not in elected officials' interest to try to shrink the economy even if there's inflation. They let the Fed be the bad guy there, right? No one wants to say, oh yeah, you're unemployed because I decided to shrink the government because I was worried about inflation. Right? No one wants to do that. Instead, they'll let the Fed be the bad guy. So these are the two different types of policies. We'll talk more about both of them next time, and specifically we'll talk about the stimulus, what that did, what its goals were and how big it was, etc., as well as some of the monetary policy interventions that took place after the 2007-2009 recession. All right. Okay. You guys have a good weekend.
All right, I got a question. When is exam 3 due?
Exam 4.
Hold on, when was it?
We're on our 4th exam.
We already got exam?
Exam 3 was like.
It was 2 weeks ago or something like that. Yeah,
It wasn't like one that we had to.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Yeah,
It was.
I remember doing
Yeah,
it. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't a profit exam. Exam 4. I'm going to go ahead and open it up on Monday, and it's going to be available all week. Now, since I'm still lecturing on Tuesday, it probably doesn't make sense to take it before Tuesday, but you know, you can.
Oh, yeah,
And I will be.
right.
And I will be here if you want to take it during class time, right? So I'll proctor it for you if you just want to come during class time. That's cool.
Yeah.
So by next Thursday or
By next Friday.
Friday?
Yeah. So
But
I won't be closing it until Friday.
like the next Thursday we can do it in class.
Yeah, you can do it in class on Thursday.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, green erase is so much better. Green and red.
Can you take the exam? I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you would have missed it because we didn't have class that day and we talked about it. And, yeah.
Yeah, because I asked him, I was like, well, we missed last Thursday. And he's like, we didn't meet last Thursday, we had a test. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I got it.
You need the door or anything? You got it?
I got it.
All right. Have a good one.